A UCLA grad student is brutally murdered, stabbed 46 times by a man hunting women who were alone. We're taking a deep dive into the case of Brianna Kupfer and what's next for her now convicted killer. Brianna's story takes us to Southern California, where the 24-year-old was a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, where she was studying architectural design. At the time of her murder, Brianna was working at an upscale boutique furniture store called Croft House, just east of the UCLA campus. She was alone there on the afternoon of January 13, 2022, when a suspicious man entered the store. He was later identified as now 34-year-old Shawn Laval Smith, who was homeless at the time of the crime. Right away, when Smith entered the store, Brianna knew something was off. So at 1:36 p.m., she texted a friend saying she had a, quote, bad vibe about a strange man in the store who was making her feel uncomfortable. 20 minutes later, another customer entered the store and found Brianna in a pool of blood. She'd been brutally stabbed to death. When first responders arrived at the scene, they found Brianna had suffered 46 stab wounds. She had 11 5-inch deep stab wounds to the chest and others to the abdomen, pelvis, as well as both legs and both arms. Investigators also found the murder weapon, a knife that had been bent over because the excessive amount of stabbing. DNA matching Shawn Smith was ultimately found on the knife, and so too was an audio recording he'd left behind at the crime scene. On the recording, Smith can be heard speaking to Brianna, at first saying he's not gonna hurt her and just ordering her to get down on the floor. Brianna can be heard screaming as Smith performs this violent attack. During this time, she tells Smith, quote, "I can help you," but he keeps repeating the phrase, it's over," before calling her an expletive. The recording also captures Smith going on an intense rant about his hatred for women. Detectives determined that after the stabbing, Smith ran out the back door of the store, leaving Brianna behind to bleed to death. This led to a major manhunt for Smith. LAPD circulated surveillance video of him around the city and offered a $250,000 reward for any info leading to his arrest and conviction. 6 days after Brianna's murder, officials received a tip that Smith had been spotted sitting on a bench in downtown Pasadena. He was arrested and then taken into custody. As news of Smith's arrest quickly spread, we learned more about his lengthy criminal history. At the time of Brianna's murder, he was out on bond from a 2019 case out of South Carolina. In that case, Smith allegedly fired a flare gun into a moving vehicle that had a child inside. Just the year prior to that incident, he pleaded guilty to a 2016 charge for resisting or assaulting a police officer. This also happened in South Carolina. He faced a separate assault on a police officer charge in January 2021 when he was arrested after vandalizing a car in San Mateo County, California. As investigators dug into Smith's history, they noticed a pattern of hatred toward women and plotting to commit murder. Prosecutors say he went from store to store hunting for a woman who was alone, and that's what led him to Brianna. After Smith's arrest, he was charged with first-degree murder with a special circumstance allegation of lying in wait. His case eventually went to jury trial, where we learned more gruesome details about the case. Just this week, jurors deliberated for only an hour, quickly determining Smith is guilty of Brianna's murder. After the verdict was handed down, the Los Angeles County District Attorney released a statement, reading in part, quote, "Brianna Kupfer was a promising young woman whose life was tragically taken far too soon. I thank the jury for their thoughtful deliberation and dedication in finding the defendant guilty. A bright and talented 24-year-old UCLA student, Brianna was dedicated to her studies in architectural design with her whole future ahead of her. Our hearts are with Brianna's family, who've shown incredible strength and resilience throughout this harrowing ordeal." Smith now faces a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, but that's not where the case ends. It's now up to a judge to determine whether Smith was sane at the time of the murder, and that decision could affect where he serves out his sentence. It's an intense case with lots to unpack, and for that, I turn to former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. This story is really difficult to talk about, one of the more graphic cases we have. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is you're out there in LA, a graduate of UCLA. So just generally, what are the vibes there about this case?
This story is both incredibly tragic and it really hit the community here hard. Anytime someone is killed, it's heartbreaking and tragic. But this was a senseless murder that really gripped the entire city of Los Angeles, but especially the UCLA community, because it's someone that, frankly, probably shouldn't have been out on the streets in the first place. You know, obviously, some of the criminal history is not out of Los Angeles or California, or someone that was on bond from another state. And he shouldn't have been, but it really brought to the forefront a lot of the issues that people have been talking about, especially during an election year. Our district attorney, George Gascon, here in Los Angeles, has received a lot of criticism for being soft on crime. He did prosecute this particular case aggressively, but he's also been a big proponent of bail reform and not holding people in custody just because they can't afford to pay. And the question is, if Smith was in custody, would Brianna still be alive right now?
You brought up a really good point because in every article I read about this case, it talks about Smith's lengthy criminal history. And I feel like that has to be considered. I mean, as you said, a lot of those prior crimes had been committed in South Carolina, so not even on the West Coast, but they still were committed and he was released on bond. I mean, what are your feelings about this? Had he been held and not released, is it possible that this crime wouldn't have happened?
I think it's very possible. And, people that are opposed to cash bail argue that it really disproportionately affects people that can't afford to pay. So, people that have money, people that have means or assets, they can post bond and get out. And people that don't, they're held indefinitely. Well, you know, even though there's a presumption of innocence, I'm coming from this as a former prosecutor. The vast majority of people who are arrested are indeed guilty. They plead guilty or they're convicted at trial. So now you're allowing people who may be violent criminals out on the street with really just a mere promise that they're going to show up to their court hearings. And many of these people are dangerous, right? I mean, if you're looking at bail, it should be really analyzed, in my opinion, based on the person's risk of flight and their danger to the community. And here you have someone who's a transient, appears to be homeless. He has no real ties to any community. He's all over the country. And he's certainly someone who's violent. And, there's been no rhyme or reason to the crimes that he's committed. And of course, ultimately he committed the ultimate crime, and that's a senseless murder, which is what happened here.
In regards to murder, after all of this happened and investigators went back and looked at the weeks leading up to it, they found some kind of disturbing things about Smith that he was hunting women. It sounds like he had a goal of committing murder. And that unto itself, it kind of preys on a woman's most primal fears that we're going to be attacked by someone when we're alone, which is what happened here. But as far as his background and his goal, I guess, to hunt down a woman, make sure that she was alone, how does all of that factor into the case?
Again, incredibly sad. Here's someone who was recording himself and talking about his hatred of women weeks before he killed Brianna. And of course, he recorded the murder itself, which was so incredibly horrific that Brianna's family left the courtroom when they played it in open court. And it hasn't even been released to the public because, again, it's that disturbing. Now, with respect to, you're right, every woman's fear, right? They've done studies and surveys and they've asked women, there are no men on earth for 24 hours. What would you do? And really, the number one answer is take a walk at night. I mean, that's how women feel about violent crimes created by men. And we know that, of course, women are disproportionately the victims of violent crime by men, not other women. So, obviously, in this particular case, you have someone who's a college student. She's working, trying to make ends meet, probably pay for that expensive college tuition. And for no reason at all, she's stalked and attacked by someone. And you know that she was afraid because Brianna was texting her friend saying that she was afraid and she was begging him to stop stabbing her. And of course, uh, there were more than 40 different wounds on her body. Um, Before she was killed.
I think you touched on one of the most heartbreaking pieces of this case. All of it is really tough, but the fact that she was alone working and she texted her friend and said, "There's a guy here who's making me really uncomfortable. Something just doesn't seem right." So you can tell her spidey senses were going off. I mean, something here is wrong. Should women feel safe to call 911 even if they have kind of a weird feeling?
They should feel safe to call 911. And hindsight is 2020. I could tell you, living in Los Angeles, working in Los Angeles, had she called 911, I don't think Los Angeles police would have done much, if anything. Even if they showed up, it certainly would have been well after she was already killed. I wish I knew the answer to prevent something like this from happening, but I don't necessarily think something would have changed if she called 911.
Brianna's murder was completely senseless and is really difficult to talk about. But I do think it's an important story to tell. And the reason we're able to share stories like Brianna's are because of our sponsors. So I want to highlight one now. That's City Lips. I recently started using City Lips and so far love the results. I've seen them in as little as 30 seconds. I think City Lips is really a game changer because it's the ultimate all-in-one solution. It adds moisture to your lips, but also looks great. Right now, you can get 15% off City Lips with the code LAW15 or go to citybeauty.com/LCnews. So we talked about what led up to the crime, but we also have to talk about the murder itself and the evidence that was left behind. If we're talking about the crime itself, you pointed out some really just disturbing things. The fact that she had more than 40 wounds on her body, that is really hard. We know that Smith left behind the murder weapon there, the knife that had his DNA on it, so obviously connecting him to the case. But then there's the other aspect of this, the recording of all of this. To me, this is crazy. I mean, he left his DNA behind, so obviously we're able to connect him there. But the fact that he also left behind a recording, that he knowingly went into this recording himself and then committed the crime, I mean, why would a defendant do that?
His lawyers are obviously going to argue that he was insane, and there's a whole proceeding that is going to happen, even though he's already been found guilty in about an hour after of jury deliberations. Obviously, this is not someone who is well, someone who hates women, someone who hunts another human being for no clear motive whatsoever, aside from the fact that she is a woman, someone that records himself, someone that leaves the recording at the crime scene, someone that stabs someone so many times. You would think it's almost a crime of passion, or he had a reason he wanted to do so. And stabbed her so many times that the knife was bent because he stabbed her so many times. And of course, he left his DNA at the scene. He was apprehended sometime thereafter. And even in court, the way he was, before the trial, the outburst, they had to essentially gag him. He wanted to represent himself. Clearly, this is someone who is not well. Now, I don't think he meets the high burden of being legally insane under the law, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But it's really hard to really draw a lot of rational inferences from someone who's behaving so irrationally and erratically.
I think erratic is a really good word here because if we're focusing on just the basic logistics of the crime, the fact that she was stabbed 46 times, that's a lot of physical exerting of your body. I mean, you're going to get tired doing that. And to me, it seems like that is overkill. That is quite a it's an intimate crime that you're so close with someone. And then the fact that you keep going, even if you may be too tired, you're still going. So that number, 46 times that Brianna was stabbed, does that to you scream overkill?
It does, and typically when we see something like that, we would say, well, it's a crime of passion, right? You're not just trying to kill this person. This is someone that you feel strongly about, but there's no connection between Brianna and Shawn Smith, at least before this murder. And that was one of the reasons why the defense tried to argue that it wasn't premeditated. It was second degree murder. That was really the only issue at trial. But this is not something that you typically see, where we know that obviously murder victims, most of the time, they know they're a murderer, right? There's a reason, there's a motive. People don't usually attack others indiscriminately. And certainly if they do, it's not this, overkill, like you said, stabbing them so many times well after they're dead, which is likely what happened here. So, obviously we know from the recording that Smith was calling Brianna expletives, even though she's begging and pleading for her life, saying that I can help you. Just please stop. So incredibly sad. And I don't think we'll ever know what's going through Shawn Smith's head. Maybe that insanity hearing where experts testify will give us some insight, but I don't think we'll fully understand the nature of this crime.
Based on the facts, it was obvious Smith would be charged with murder, but there's an added aspect of the charge that Nima says is really important. As far as the charge, it was first-degree murder, but there was something extra that was added to it, special circumstance allegation of lying in wait. Can you explain that part to me?
This is important. So, under California law, there is a moratorium on the death penalty. So, we are not a death penalty state here in California, and no one's been executed for quite some time. So, even though if you believe in the death penalty and he's not insane, this is a case that merits the death penalty. That's just not an option for someone like Shawn Smith. So, there's different degrees of murder, and you have first degree, you have second degree, and it affects the sentence. So, second degree murder, there's only a mandatory sentence of 25 to life, and so someone can presumably be on parole after some period of time. First degree murder with a special circumstance has a mandatory life sentence. So that's what we call LWOP, life without the possibility of parole. So that was an important enhancement and an important charge because that means unless he's insane, and even if he's insane, he's probably going to be in a mental facility for life. But regardless, Smith is going to die without ever being in the general population again where he might harm someone.
And if we're talking about the deliberation, it was about an hour that it took. I mean, there was an overwhelming amount of evidence that was presented by the prosecution. And to me, it seems like jurors went in the other room, filled out some forms, and came back and they knew he was guilty. What do you make of that really quick deliberation?
I believe that the evidence was overwhelming, not just beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond any doubt. And, everyone's entitled to a legal defense, and I understand why Smith's lawyer made the argument that he did, but how could you possibly defend a case like this? Even if you're a defense lawyer, even if you're representing murderers, because, like you said, it's his audio, it's his DNA. You know, what other evidence do you want if you're a prosecutor? Now, the defense tried to argue that it was not premeditated, right? Here's someone who snapped for whatever reason because of his mental issues. So that, of course, would not be first degree. It would be murder, it'd be second degree, but not first degree. It wouldn't be lying awake, wouldn't be premeditation. Obviously, a very difficult argument to make still, but at least I respect the defense for not trying to argue that it wasn't me or this was a crime of passion, which would be manslaughter. They just tried to give Smith the possibility of somehow getting out of prison. Obviously, the jurors saw right through it and they convicted right away.
So he's been convicted of this first degree murder charge, pretty severe, but the case isn't quite over yet because we have the underlying thing we've been talking about this entire conversation, his mental health status. And now that's going to be up to a judge to decide whether he was sane at the time of the murder. What's interesting to me here is that he just went through a jury trial and then kind of waived his right to the jury trial for the next part of it. What do you make of all that?
So, when it comes to an insanity defense, it has to be proven by the defendant. The burden's preponderance, but normally, right, a defendant doesn't have to say or do anything. It's up to the government or the people, the prosecution to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a different standard when it comes to insanity. The defendant needs to put on experts and to prove, usually to a jury, but of course, it's the defendant's right to a jury trial. They can waive that right and have a judge hear the case. And now Smith and his lawyers are going to have to prove to a judge that because of a mental disease or defect, he didn't understand what he was doing and that it was wrong. Again, high burden, not easy to prove, but whether it was a judge or a jury in this case, I don't think, given his history of violence, given the fact that there's recordings, she's begging for her life and he's still stabbing Brianna, saying that, you know, terrible things to her, I don't think he meets the burden, the high one, of proving insanity under California law. And ultimately, he's going to spend the rest of his life in California State Prison.
Talking about that coming hearing where the judge is going to have to make that pretty big decision, I know that you said mental health experts rather, are going to testify likely. Is it possible that we see Smith himself testify?
It's certainly possible. It's hard to testify that you're insane, um, and take the stand and testify in any kind of rational manner. So obviously, if a defendant testifies in any type of case, they're subject to cross-examination. So oftentimes, most of the time, nearly every time, in an insanity case, you're going to see experts testify because if a defendant testifies in any type of case, the entire case is going to come down to his or her testimony. So they're going to have to get on the stand, be subject to cross examination, and convince a judge or a jury that they're insane. Very hard to do. Usually, if you're a defense lawyer, you're going to put on experts, psychiatrists, psychologists, folks that really opine to the mental fitness, capacity, incapacity, insanity of defendants, really trained experts to prove your case. You're not going to rely on an unhinged, violent, and really unpredictable defendant like Shawn Smith.
Smith is due back in court on October 2nd for the next phase of his case. It's now up to a California judge to determine whether he was sane at the time of the murder. For Law and Crime, I'm Gillespie.